somebody who's actually in your environment maliciously leaking that data. So it's somebody there that maybe has a grudge, maybe it's for profit, they have legitimate credentials, somebody probably you're employing, or in this case sometimes maybe a student who's legitimately inside the environment. And again, a bunch of different motives behind the turncloak. Might be selling, trying to sell information, make profit, whatnot. The pawn is your normal employee, the do-gooder that makes a mistake. And that mistake costs them. Somebody exploits that mistake. Perhaps he sends an email with an Excel spreadsheet to the wrong address with some sensitive information in it. Again, it's not that they're trying to make a mistake. They're not trying to cause a problem, but they screw up, they make a mistake, lose a laptop, and somebody takes advantage of it. The imposter is where somebody actually gets in, an outsider who's acquired credentials of the insider. So again, it's malicious in intent. They have acquired credentials from a legitimate person who should be on your network. And what we often see here with the imposter, though, is, as in most organizations, people have way too much access. So as soon as somebody gets access to an account, gets those credentials, if the access isn't locked down, they may have access to a lot more than you think they do. And as we know, over time, access tends to grow with employees. Thank you. That feels much better.
Excuse me 1 second. Let's see if we got this. It should be, I was told there should be a green light.
Secret combination.
Just press and hold it till it turns green. There you go.
Now we're up and rolling. All right. And lastly here, basically I don't mean to be negative here, but we should assume that they're already in. Either turncloak, pawn, or imposter. And several years back I went to an FBI debriefing, and that was a bunch of other stuff was said, but that was really the core of what they were telling us was, no matter the size of your organization, you better assume that they're already in, because in most cases they are, or if they want to, they can be easily. So the script here, here's some of the steps involved in a typical breach. So first of all, we have the get inside, usually done by phishing or social engineering. I think a lot of us probably know how effective and easy that is. These days, phishing is rampant. Just had a customer hit by a phishing attack just this last week. And they're doing more of what's called spear phishing also, that most of you probably know about, where they're getting information about their target and then targeting that person, and perhaps even saying it's coming from, another department manager, which would be accurate. And then might even spoof the email address, and they're getting really good about how they're targeting their attacks there. And then once they get inside, the next thing they do is they're going to be snooping around. This is more of the discovery phase. So this is where they go through and try to perhaps elevate their permissions and privileges, see where they can get around in your environment. Also, they can use some pretty easy tools to see what's in your environment, see what you guys have. For instance, Windows search with content enabled. That's a way to be able to get around and just start browsing your data and seeing what's out there, see what they have access to. Another one is just like you see here, the PowerShell command with the find string command. And right there, that's actually a string that will help find Visa cards in your network. They can just fire that off and see what they discover. So again, this second phase is seeing what they can find, seeing if they can find another route to elevate their permissions, get around some other defenses, and just grow their base and discover more data in your environment. And of course, then we also have the exfiltration phase. And this is where they're trying to get that data out. And this is where that, if you haven't detected them, hopefully at least you can stop them at this point. Perhaps see what they're trying to do, have something tell you that somebody's accessing this data and maybe trying to open a bunch of files now that they normally don't open, or open a bunch of files with sensitive information that they normally don't open. Something to be able to show that they're trying to get that data out there. And so insider threats are growing, and the average incident results in about $800,000 of damage. And as you can see here on the charts here, that misdelivery on the left-hand side there, 44%. So again, it's not necessarily intentional. It's an accident, so to speak. You know, we're humans. We make accidents. And publishing error, disposal error, misconfiguration, malfunction. On the right-hand side here, what is getting out there? Well, most is documents. Again, that unstructured data. Word files, Excel files, PowerPoint presentations, PDFs, all that type of information. That tends to be what is leaked the most. And of course, you got web apps, desktop, and you start getting down into some of the other media there. So, not unexpectedly, privilege abuse is tops the list here, 88%. So, this is where people actually have access to data, legitimate access to data, but do they need it? Too much access is kind of what we're talking about here. So, in your environment, you have people that perhaps were in one department when they signed up. I'm just going to pick maybe HR. And then after a few years, they end up transferring to legal. We grant them permissions to legal, but how often do we go back and revoke those permissions to the old role, so to speak, HR? We generally don't. You know, either we're not asked to by HR department or whoever's in charge of that, or we just leave that around because we think they might need it for a while, and it just grows and grows and grows. Consequently, what else can happen is somebody comes now into legal, and what happens? They sit down next to that person and says, well, you know, Kathy needs the same permissions as John over here, so why don't you just clone that account? Great, now they just inherited all those other permissions that that person didn't need. So when it comes to the privilege abuse, misuse, a lot of times, again, that's because people have way too much access. The idea is to try to lock it down just to the access they need and remediate some of the old access that they no longer need. So, got a couple examples here. On the left-hand side, that's actually a real snippet from somebody's Visa card. Very happy to post it. They were stoked about getting that card. That's great. Let's put it on the internet so everybody can see it. This real-world example, this happens. You know, people just aren't thinking about what they're doing. On the right-hand side here, Google can also crawl FTP. And so if you have a misconfiguration perhaps in your web server, it can end up, I don't know if you guys can see it here, but it can end up showing some of the passwords there that are in just plain text. So again, we need to make sure that have our systems, one, not make the mistake of not thinking about what we're doing with that sensitive information, but also having our systems locked down and configured and tuned properly. And just, people make mistakes. So you've kind of seen that the previous slide was about outside. This is kind of behind the firewall. Again, snooping behind the firewall, what can happen? Well, here again, we're showing the Windows search, and you can just index properties and file contents. Enable that, and then it'll start to scan through some of the documents, the contents of your documents, and find some of that sensitive information. And then the person who's on the inside can then start identifying that sensitive information and then start going to that exfiltration stage of getting that out. And the right-hand side here shows a little freeware program, everything. That pretty much shows quite a bit in your environment there. They can fire off and they can see a lot of information. Again, these are some of the mechanisms they may use once they're on the inside, the 3 different types of actors that we have here. So talking about target here. So we got a bunch of fancy tools watching the perimeter, but what's happening on the inside? You know, we've got firewalls and a bunch of different systems monitoring what's coming in or maybe what's going out, but if they're already on the inside, do you have anything to actually detect that? And you're only as strong as your weakest link. If that's on the inside and you have nothing monitoring your actual data, then you don't have any clue what's happening. Maybe they're not actually trying to get it out through a firewall. Maybe they're just trying to dump it off onto a local system, a local drive, thumb drive, take it and go. Do you have anything to detect that? And in the case of Target, that was pretty much, if I remember right, it was a refrigeration company. So it was a third-party company that had legitimate credentials to be inside the environment, but ended up sticking those credentials on a sticky next to a water cooler in their company, and somebody decided to go ahead and utilize that. Now, why they had permissions and access to the POC systems in Target, Refrigeration Company? Again, too much access. That's where we need to all be careful about what type of access people have and tighten that up. So here we come to the mountain lion part. What do you feel more? If I say shower, taking a shower, does that build up any fear inside of you? Or do I say, you know, kind of hungry mountain lion growling, staring at you, does that build up fear inside of you? Irrational biases. We are way more likely to slip in the shower and hurt ourselves than to be attacked by a mountain lion. But what do we fear more? The mountain lion. Again, that's just more of an irrational bias and a fear. And it's kind of like the thing goes back to flying and driving. You know, a lot of times when we're driving, it's a thing we do every day and we're no worries. We just jump in our car and go. But when we get on a plane, we have more fear about that. Maybe because we're not in control. You know, if we're control freaks, I might be a little bit. But again, flying is much safer than driving, statistically. Yet we fear that which is a little more unknown to us, or maybe we're a little more out of our control. So another one, fear and frequency. Large Midwestern University here in 2014 announced that 146,000 students' data, including Social Security numbers and other information, has been exposed. And this is not because of a hacker, but simply because somebody saved a file in the wrong public folder. So again, they didn't even send it outside of the company necessarily. They didn't email it. It's just saved into a public folder. And I can tell you from personal experience, I've seen quite a bit of this throughout the different organizations I support in the Northwest here. You'd be amazed at where the public folders, or even a location on your network that has access to everyone, authenticated users, all those, you're amazed at what type of sensitive information lies in those areas.
Do you see that more as a problem with legal now, with the ability to share out beyond?
It is getting worse as you start to share out into the internet there, start to drop things on Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive. Correct. It's no longer is all your data now contained in your environment, but it's now being kept elsewhere in somebody else's environment, so to speak. Do you have insight into that? You know, are you monitoring that environment? That's a good question. We do see that happening more and more. And so, you know, you're probably thinking, you know, what's the odds of that happening to us? You know, 1 in 1,000. You know, that sounds like pretty good odds, but let's kind of a little different part. Again, put together by marketing. Let's talk about trees. So a renowned scientist, Jared Diamond, spent 50 years doing field research in New Guinea. And Early in his career, he was in a trip, and he wanted to pitch his party's tent under a tree, a big healthy tree. Looked like it was a healthy tree in the forest there. And his New Guinea friends refused to do that. They just did not want to pitch a tent under that tree. And they explained that it was a dead tree and it could fall on them. Well, he went ahead and still pitched his tent under that tree, and they went out into an open field, no tent, pitched their tent out there and slept in the open field for the night. And he, of course, thought they were paranoid and their fears were exaggerated, but in the following years he came to realize that he heard. And so that just illustrates that that idea that it's not going to happen to us, the 1 in 1,000, it's not going to happen, but as that just is a 1 in 1,000 every day, and as you step through it and step through it, you're getting closer and closer to being bit by that. So again, we need to be able to watch what's happening in our environment and lock those permissions down and know where that sensitive data is. Know if sensitive data gets dropped into a public share. So kind of our focus on frequency here. You know, we've all met the IT person, the engineer who's just spends weeks obsessing over you know, which password hacking algorithm they want to use, or hashing algorithm they want to use, but end up failing to implement a solid password policy, right? So on the left-hand side, I think everybody can see that, but it's you know, thinking about how they can crack this and get into it and whatnot. And on the right-hand side, it's just like, let's just drug them and hit them with a wrench. You know, simple. He'll tell us. And that's really the kind of the truth about our environment. We'll spend a lot of time debating on, you know, maybe which algorithm to use and maybe, you know, the strength of SHA 256 and all of that. But, you know, while we're debating that, you know, we got employees emailing information to Nigerian princes. You know, I don't remember those emails where they'd say they're Nigerian prince, you know, send me your information, all this kind of stuff. But it's comes down to more of a common sense. You know, look at where the broad exposure is and address that first, kind of in a funnel approach. When you get down to it and debating certain things about which is more secure than another, think about it. Is this even really that important compared to the broader picture there? What are our users doing? So they're in, and now what? Going to cover 6 different things here. Eliminate global access, excessive permissions, and I don't think you want me to read the list here and there necessarily. But this list was put together by over our 10 years plus, working with some extremely large customers. And again, what we saw in their environment and how to mitigate the risks that they have. So, global access. You know, I bet everybody in this room is pretty familiar with the global access groups. Everyone, authenticated users. Again, they're widely used. They've, for many years, have been a default when you establish a share in your environment. The everyone group there. There's, from my experience with seeing a large amount of customers' environments, there's only a few, just a few that I came across that really didn't have some really ugly global access group situation in their environment, with the everyone group specifically. And again, you know, this is one of our big issues, trying to cut that down and give access to people who just need access to that data. Eliminate excessive permissions. It's kind of where we're going back into that. Finding out exact permissions now instead of from a global access point of view, just from even a user account or another security group. Where do they have access to? Are you able to see that in your environment? Are you able to spot that? Are you able to take, like Andrew, I can't pronounce that last name, but Andrew's account there, and see where Andrew has access to in the environment? We see a lot of times the security groups are in, but now do you know where every place in your environment those security groups have access? That's a pretty big challenge for all of us to be able to determine that. And you got to see the whole big picture before you can really start cranking that access down and tightening that up. And again, we talked about it before, the permissions creep, about how people maybe are assigned to a different group for a different project or switch to a different department, and they just start growing their permissions. Again, we need to have ways to, processes in place to remediate those permissions. And sometimes the human factor fails. You know, sometimes we don't get that message from HR that this person moved to this other department, and we don't go in and remove those old permissions. So do we have any kind of systems and processes in place to remediate those permissions? Any kind of automated system? You know, that's another route to use. So, alert on privilege escalations. Sorry, having a hard time talking here. So, the bullet point up there, do you know when someone gets root access? Do you know when someone's added to domain administrators in your environment? Do you get an alert on that? You know, here's a, this is setting up what we call data alert. The top one is setting it up to build that alert for you when anybody is added to the domain admins group. So again, somebody's getting inside your environment. They're looking to try to grow their permissions, and boy, if they can get domain admin, they're stoked, they're happy. We need to be watching these types of permission elevations and escalations and be on top of that if that happens there. So, alert on behavioral deviations here. So, one thing that I'll talk about Varonis specific here that we do is that Varonis will baseline your user and your resource activity. So if you think about what your users do, perhaps what your students do, generally over a period of time they're doing about the same amount of transactions, events per day. You know, perhaps Sally is doing about 1,000 events per day, and that's creating files, modifying files, sending emails, working on SharePoint documents, all of that. And Varonis will baseline all that. But then if Sally, instead of 1,000 events per day, all of a sudden you see 30,000 events happen in that day, don't you want to know about that? You know, what has changed? What's different? That's where we call behavioral deviation. And if you're not tracking what your users are doing or tracking even what your platforms are doing, storage platform, Exchange, all of that, you're not be able to see those spikes. You aren't able to see that deviation. So on your storage system, again, it has a certain amount of average per day, or let's say Exchange. All of a sudden, next day, that's 4 times that. What's happening in your environment? You know, on the file system, for her, maybe it was crypto run under credentials. Maybe it wasn't something she was doing. But we have seen cases where somebody was going on to taking an opportunity at another organization, and what do they generally do when somebody leaves your organization? They go through, they delete files, stuff that they think you don't need anymore. They copy data off to take with them to the next organization. So again, it's maybe not even intentionally malicious. They're just thinking, I created these files. This is all the stuff that I did, so I own it. But it's actually the organization's data, your data, and so you need to be able to be alerted to all that.
Question for the crowd. What would
Yeah.
be and we're familiar with this from the corporate standpoint very much on property. What would be the example that on the education side of when someone was leaving that would be taking money data? What examples can you give us?
You're taking student data, they could be taking test scores.
Why would they be doing that though?
Because it's intermixed with their files and folders
Right.
and
Yep.
crap that
Yep.
folks continue, you know, especially if they're in a district for a long period of time and they decide to move.
10, 15 years of crap sitting out
Yeah,
there.
and they want to take it all with them.
Yep.
And, you know, in IT, a lot of times we have no idea what's intermixed with that data.
Precisely.
And quite frankly, a lot of times the educator doesn't know what's in there either, but they want to make sure they don't forget anything and they take everything with them, right? And I
Yep.
can tell by just reading people's body language here real quick.
Faces and-
Everybody
yep.
knows what I'm talking about. It happens all the time.
Exactly. And
We call that, they call that the employee early warning, what do you call it?
oh, the
Resignation detection system.
yep, exactly. Yeah, in just a brief sideline, in our software, you can actually click on that spike and just start browsing down by user or just by resource, however you want, browsing down and see exactly where those 4,500 events took place. And in a demo that we do, the data that we use actually comes from a customer who let us use their data for our demo, and that's what happened. A customer did a bunch of transactions to copy data off, and then 2 days later gave their notice. And that customer went back and found that she had copied all this information off. So the resignation detection system
Yeah,
joke came about.
We use the software internally, and we're a small company. But we had an engineer that departed us, or actually a security consultant engineer that departed, and went to work for one of the big four. And we looked up what they did just before that person left, and they copied all of our data. All of our client, or not client data, but just some of our proprietary information, and of our security practice. And we take that to the big four consulting firm with him, and we were able
Yep.
to prove that he took it and brought it with him, and we of course lost the job at that firm, and we were able to recover all the data.
You didn't know your software was collecting that.
Didn't quite think it through, thankfully.
It was fun, yeah. Yeah, we had to buy it.
Yep. So again, the perimeter defenses is just not enough. You need to be watching what's inside your environment. And you brought up sensitive data. That's true. Do you have something to show you what is in that data? I was in the field for, in the trenches for many years, and as you're at a place, you do start to feel like this is your data. Your home drive is your data. Well, you have a bunch of mixed data in there. Some stuff may be personal, other stuff is business that you dropped in there to work on it wherever, whenever.
Does your product, does it do proactive reduction of permissions or approval systems? So if it starts detecting anomalies like this, does it lock it down and say, hey, you can continue, but only after you get approval from the supervisor or some other person?
Good question. We'll be able to alert you on this type of activity, so we can send you an email alert, send it out through to a SIM or something like that if you have that. But we can also run
Reactive, though.
right. You can run PowerShell scripts, so you could probably build a script to do something like that. But we don't have a mechanism to actually send that off and say, do you want to approve this? Now we do for granting permissions to, say, folder shares or security groups. If you want to do that, there's automated ways we have to do that, but not to do that specifically. Good question, though.
Yeah,
Sounds like a feature request to me.
It does. It does.
Some of the proactive piece is that, by using the tool, you're able to manage your data, manage your permissions, to where they can't do that anymore because they don't have access to enough anymore, and they have only access to stuff that is appropriate for their permissions. So you're really limiting your exposure. That's
And
Yep.
I'm just in the case of this example where, he already copied all the data. So, he could walk out and go all the data. Granted, you were able to get it back,
Yeah.
but, we already had it. So there's a possibility that given the state of the country or whatever, if you announce their data, nothing you do about it.
Yep. Exactly. No, it's a good question. There's multiple things that we do. So for one, find that sensitive data. We talked about setting up alerts. You can set up an alert on when sensitive data is dropped to a public folder. And so in that case, we can alert somebody in IT when that occurs. We also have a data mover that can actually, when that happens, alert IT that occurred, and then move that sensitive data to a secured location changing the permissions on the fly and locking that data down, and then now letting you know where that data lives now. So there's ways to automate that. In the case, say this was CryptoLocker firing off and making this spike here. We can alert you to that. You know, say after 100 file modifieds in 1 minute, you know, then we'll kick off an alert, let you know what's happening, and then we can run a PowerShell script to actually lock that user account down and disable crypto in its tracks within minutes instead of days, weeks, months.
And this is, again, all local network drive, nothing cloud-based, correct?
We do support cloud, Office 365. We haven't gone to Google yet. We've been talking about that, but the Office 365.
Feature request number 2.
Number 2. You guys are giving me a lot of work here.
And that's probably...
I would vote it to 1.
Drive for, I mean, I can't
You're
speak for
talking
everybody,
educators, but
But you're
Right.
talking to a lot of, I would assume, a lot of people in this room are pretty heavily vested in the Google.
In Google
ecosystem.
platforms,
And
yep.
If
Yep.
your product can't do that, then it's kind of, it's not useless, but it's.
this is not the right crowd.
It's one of those things that we would
Right.
need it to do.
And it's certainly on their radar for development. They just decided to focus on the Microsoft offering first, and then they're going to be looking at Google. But I don't have a timeline on that.
If
So
anyone needs Drive, Google Drive, that same functionality in Google Drive, social security protection, sharing out, whatever. Cloud Lock does that.
Cloud Lock?
Cloud Lock.
LOCK?
Cloud, like cloud and lock.
Okay.
talked about detecting CryptoLocker already. You know, in our case here, 100 file modifieds per minute. We're also looking for different things like decrypt instructions, .text, and different things like that. So if we find those files created in your environment, we have alerts based upon that. Here again, notify IT admins, username, password. Talk about, you know, disabling that account if need be. We even have the latest version in Varonis. We're even more proactive. Instead of building your own alerts, we now have a team we have assembled that will pre-build alerts. And from what I'm told, I can't promise anything, but we are rolling out updates to those alerts, and their idea is eventually get into more of a AV style of updating, where we might have an agent and you'll just get updates as soon as it's released. And currently right now they've built out 60 different threat models, so all you have to do is just enable it for your environment. An example is CryptoLocker is one of them. You just enable it and it'll start looking for crypto and monitoring for crypto-like activity in your environment. Another one, domain admins. Somebody added to that user group, it'll automatically alert you after you enable that one. Another one, great example of just looking at user behavior is, say somebody from the mailroom all of a sudden starts to access C-level data, you know, something out of the norm. They have access, they shouldn't have access, they haven't been using it, but now they start using that access. Or maybe they're just accessing sensitive information that they don't normally access. We're going to be able to alert you upon that because we see in baseline their normal access. We know where sensitive data is. We know they're not accessing sensitive data, or hardly at all. It shouldn't be from the mailroom. But if all of a sudden they start, we'll start alerting you to that. Same thing with stale data. If they all of a sudden start accessing a bunch of stale data, we'll alert you to that. So currently I think there's 61 different threat models that they've built out. Yeah?
Would it be the same for, you said Office 365 integration for emails? Like if an email is sending out a bunch of spam, could it detect that and stop that user from?
So kind of a threshold based upon email. For Office 365, I don't think they're there yet for the Exchange component. It's an interesting one. I'll have to look into that and see if we can do that.
Are you using any sort of MTA or any sort of spam filter on with 365 already?
Yeah, we moved away from those. That's another thing we didn't do. Like, we've had phishing issues, and what we did was create a PowerShell script, but we've got a lot of modified, so it looks not top centered by recipient count, and usually you get numbers that are around 100, 200,
happens quickly. So we have that, so this is kind of a nice idea where we could add, we change that password with the certificate counts low. But that's what we did, sends us an email so we know what's happening. So we're it's reactive, but
You're aware.
the way to do it.
Yep.
It's gonna be,
You're at least aware of it. So good. Yep. Again, a little more on CryptoWall. It's just talking about where we're seeing some of these things occur in the same time period. We're also seeing those decrypt instructions, .html and all that. Back to this one, just again briefly about Avronis. We show you where users have access across all those different platforms we talked about, but we also do full auditing of what they're doing with their access, and that's kind of where this is coming from here. You can see which server. This doesn't have the user column on it, but you'll be able to see which user it is, time and date, server, the resource, object, what they're doing, file created, success, all that information there. So full auditing on what the users are doing in your file shares, Exchange, and SharePoint. So honeypots is another tip here. We talk about that, and some people have a hard time with honeypots. They think it may be encouraging people to do things they normally wouldn't do. It depends on which side of the fence you're on, but what we talk about is maybe setting up a honeypot, setting up some shares there like payroll, confidential, CEO, putting some fake data in there, and then just monitoring who's accessing that. Who are the people that snoop around? It doesn't mean that they're instantly, bad guys and they need to be taken care of, but at least at least you start to know who to monitor more so. But if somebody does come in, somebody gets access to, somebody's credentials, maybe a third party on the outside there, starts hitting these, you'll be able to see that activity too and jump on it. So monitor high-risk people and data. I think I probably talked about this one a little out of order too. So, so alerting and maybe quarantining sensitive data when it shows up in a public place. Again, we're able to see where your sensitive data is, who has access, what they're doing with it. And we can see when that drops into a location, we can build a rule. Say, hey, if any sensitive data drops into a location that's open to everyone, domain users, authenticated users, any of that kind of, those groups there, alert, and then maybe automatically move it. Change permissions so only IT admins have access to it and let them know where it is. And then you guys can go find that sensitive information, see what it is, put it in a proper location, and then talk to the people who've been moving that around. I think we've touched on a lot of these already. Watch what root and domain admins are doing in your environment. This is a sensitive one. I don't want to get anything thrown at me, but we need to watch our users, but we need to watch our IT admins. There's a lot of cases where a rogue admin causes a bunch of problems. You talked about sound like an engineer in your environment. Those are more the admin level type of people that have access to a lot more information. So we need to be able to watch and baseline all that activity from all the users, even yourself included. It's just grab everybody and see what everybody's doing because we're all human.
What about the reverse of that, where maybe these people were under scrutiny, like, what are you doing? You guys are looking at this. Would they be able to show that, no, look, I'm approved, I haven't been snooping around, I don't have access, I haven't done that.
Yeah.
So it's a positive spin on that.
Yeah, precisely. You can. You'll be able to, again, take any account and see where they have access across your resources there. And so perhaps they don't even have access. But if they do have access, then you go back to all that audit data in the log section, and you can show exactly what they did during that time period. So somebody accuses somebody of doing something last week. Well, you pull up that information for that person for last week, and you just look at it and say, didn't happen. Maybe they deleted a bunch of files or were accused of doing that. And the audit information shows 2 deletes, and they were just, Word docs that the other person owned in their home folder. Yeah, good point. And, you know, when it comes to contractors, again, you need to be able to watch them, what they're doing. Contractors, if they're administrative contractors, you know, admins, are they even going into email? Looking in somebody's email, C-level people, administrator people, looking into other people's email, and then setting it to mark as unread. You know, with Varonis, you're able to find that type of activity. You actually see when emails are marked as unread, and you can detect that. And that we detected that in several organizations here last year. So, last slide here. Just want to say there's a free threat assessment that we do, and that depending on your organization, it can be about a 26-page report, and there's no charge with that. That's free. We're able to actually drop Varonis into your environment, monitor it for, you know, 30 days or so, and then deliver you this report. And we'll talk about some different pertinent information you might want to know about Active Directory, and maybe some things to clean up and secure up in Active Directory, and also on your file shares and SharePoint sites. And if see me or Matt there, if you ever want to set one of those up. And we do all the heavy lifting. You guys just spin up a VM for us of Windows Server 2012 R2 if you want. Have SQL available. And I can actually come in and install Varonis and take care of all that, configuring it in about an hour and a half. So it's pretty lightweight, low-key, and then we can just let it run. Or I can show you how to use it all, and you can use it as you wish for a whole month there.
How is it licensed?
Great question. So it's when it comes to education, it's licensed per essentially FTE that accesses your data. So not students. We don't license it per students. It would be licensed per your full-time employees that are accessing the data on your network. So not janitorial staff, nothing like that. You know, if you got you know, Alan who comes in for 10 hours during a week, you know, you don't even count him. Pretty much what you consider FTE who access your full-time data. A lot of times it correlates next to your Microsoft licensing agreements and that user account.
Is it broken down any more granular than that, or once you purchase a license, you get your Exchange, SharePoint, and your file shares?
It is per platform too. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's and we've got Matt here, and then also Brett, sales rep from Varonis here, that can talk to you more about that kind of stuff. I'm just the lowly engineer, but but it is per platform also. So exactly correct. The Windows platform, and that also includes storage systems like NetApp, EMC, and then Exchange and SharePoint. And then there's some other things too. If you have a large environment, over 50 servers, like over 50 Windows file share servers, not just servers in general, but servers that are delivering file shares, you know, then there could be a little, might need what's called a probe to add on to that. And yep. Yeah, but if you guys have any questions, see Matt or from NCA or Brett. Any other questions about anything related here?
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I'd like to explain a little bit about something that, let me first ask, how many of you, this is the first conference you've been to, ACP conference? Okay, there are a number of giveaways throughout the conference, which people seem to enjoy a great deal, which is why we keep doing it. And in the evening events where the vendors are, you can go to the vendors. They will provide you with poker chips. The poker chips can be traded in for tickets. The tickets can then be used to put into drawings. As you go out and you go through the altitude room on your right, you will see a bunch of things that we're giving away. And they're raffles and they're bowls, and you put in half a ticket, or you get a ticket and you keep the coupon. You know how that works. So one of the things that I get to do by being on the board, I get really high-level jobs. I get to hand out a ticket to all of you as you leave, so that you have a ticket. But part of why we do this, the obvious is, you get the chips, they can be traded in for tickets. The goal is to go see vendors and to mix and thank them for what they do. The other side of this is for you to enjoy yourself, decide what prizes that you're interested in, And the other part that I will say also as a board member, you and your district have to decide what happens if you win something. Most of you are probably getting paid to be here, so we'll let you and your district decide how all of that works out. So again, thank you for coming. Next session started at 2:45. We'll see you there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice job. You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, record button.